Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, April 14th, 1865, midway through watching a play at the Ford's Theater, President Abraham Lincoln is fatally shot by John Wilkes Booth. Obviously, a major moment in American history, lots to discuss, including what it feels like when a country appears to be tearing apart into regional factions. We're joined, as always, by Nicole Hemmer of Columbia, and Jamelle Bouie of the New York Times is still with us as our special guest for this episode. Hello to both of you.
Hello, Jody.
Hello there.
Okay, so obviously Lincoln's assassination is in every history book. So Jamelle, convince me that there are parts of this story that people don't know and need to think about.
Sure. So the part of the story that I often lead with is the events that lead directly to his assassination. So we all know John Wilkes Booth, a prominent actor from an acting family in Baltimore, is the assassin. But what a lot of people don't know is that Booth, a few days earlier, had heard Lincoln give a speech about what will happen in the aftermath of the war. And Lincoln floats suffrage for black soldiers. And it's upon hearing this that Booth essentially says to himself, or to his friend who was with him, that he's going to kill Lincoln. That it's not just that the Confederacy has been beaten, but that extending suffrage to blacks is just going too far. And this is sort of the precipitating thing for Booth to begin to plan Lincoln's assassination.
So does that make this moment a little more complex, or are you saying that there's a sort of strain there in his thinking that represents some bigger thing going on?
Lincoln is one of these Americans who is now a secular saint, right? Sort of is almost a religious figure for Americans in a lot of ways. But what that should illustrate and emphasize is in 1865, in the moment, Lincoln was an intensely divisive figure. Millions of Americans, not just in the South, were not unhappy to see him assassinated. And telling the story of what motivated Booth, I think, is a glimpse into the politics of the moment that helped produce a situation where someone or a group of people would be plotting to assassinate the president. And those politics are simply that the defeat of the Confederacy represented the destruction of an entire social system, and that the prospect voting rights, even for a small number of blacks, represented a truly radical transformation of American society. And that is the kind of thing that will produce deep-seated resistance, including trying to kill the leader responsible for it.
It brings us to, I think, a really fascinating what if about what if he had survived, what the next phase of American politics would look like. We'll put a pin in that for a second and come back. But Nikki, I want to ask you one other thing about this moment, because, one thing I think if we're listing things people forget is that there were also plans to assassinate Secretary of State William Seward and VP Andrew Johnson. Seward survived, and the person assigned to go after Johnson backed out. But, in kind of thinking about this, it makes me think, should we think of this moment as a coup, right? As a real attempt to take down the architecture of the American power structure? And does that change our thinking of it rather than, one crazed actor going after one individual president?
Yes, we should absolutely think of it as a coup. That's absolutely what had been planned by the actors involved.
Actors involved. Nicely done.
They were going to take out the leadership of the U.S. government, this government that they had been at war with for the past 4 years. So it also shouldn't surprise us that there was a coup attempt against the U.S. government. And I think what Jamelle was also getting at is that, Lincoln's statement about extending the franchise to Black Americans, that was something that people didn't know at the time was going to happen. They knew that the war had ended, but all of the radical changes that happen after that fundamentally restructure what the electorate looks like, what people with rights and citizenship in the U.S. looks like, none of that stuff could be taken for granted. Not a lot of people knew that was actually going to happen.
Just to add to that although by this point the 13th Amendment had been passed by Congress, that was the extent of really any political consensus that we would end slavery. But ending slavery is just the first step to a whole host of questions of what are the rights of African Americans? Are they actually citizens of the country? What does the government owe to them? What do we do with former Confederates? We're talking about, in the wake of the Civil War, basically regime change in the United States, restructuring the entire society. And it makes sense, right, that there would be plenty of people who would say no way and, again, want to murder the president.
So I guess that walks us up to, and I will say, I think we want to avoid what ifs on this podcast. It's something I think it naturally comes up, but it is an interesting question here, which is, had Lincoln survived this era that was coming that you just started to describe, how do you think he would have handled Reconstruction, and how would that have looked differently?
It's difficult to say because it's so complex. So what actually happens, right, is that Lincoln is assassinated. Andrew Johnson, as vice president, takes office. Johnson was chosen as part of a unity ticket in 1864 and was a Tennessee Democrat, though a Unionist Democrat, but not a radical Republican, not at all invested in any semblance of Black rights, and in fact very incredibly racist, even for the era, incredibly racist, and very hostile to the idea of Black equality in any sense. And so under his control, presidential Reconstruction, that first sort of 2 years, ends up being an attempt to re-enfranchise former Confederates, including leaders. The vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, is elected to Congress and seated under Johnson. The Southern states passed their Black codes, which are sort of the precursors to Jim Crow later in the century. It's all a big mess. And so none of that would have happened, right? Because you can safely say that had Lincoln survived, he would have not allowed that kind of thing to happen. He would have gone for an attempt to reintegrate the former Confederate states, but the kind of extreme leniency of the Johnson administration, I don't think he would have seen. The flip side of that, though, right, is that Johnson's leniency is part of what pushes the radical Republicans in Congress to be as radical as they were. And so in the absence of that dialectical tension, right? Like, is the radical Republican response what it is? So do we end up getting a moderate Reconstruction in the later chunk of the period, in part because Lincoln in the beginning is not as forgiving and lenient as Johnson actually was?
Yeah, I think you can say that while there wasn't a successful coup, there was a successful regime change. This was a very different regime than the Lincoln regime. And even though we can't say what all the consequences for that were, it was something that happened.
I want to end with one little tidbit from this, which is a man by the name of Samuel Seymour was the last surviving person who had been in Ford's Theater the night of the assassination. He was 10 years old when he was there, which, first off, who's taking a 10-year-old to the theater? But he lived until 1956 and was on TV in 1956 on a game show called I've Got a Secret. And, this video is out there in the world, and it's fascinating to see people realize, oh, my gosh, you were there. But, it's just a reminder that 1956 is not that, I can go talk to my parents about 1956. I can talk to my grandparents about that era. My grandmother has memories of seeing Civil War veterans at a parade in Philadelphia when she was a kid. I mean, it is just a reminder of how quickly you can hop to these eras that feel like they're in such distant past.
Good job finding some esoterica for this very well-known story.
Exactly. That was my job. A good shout out to Jacob Feldman for researching that one. Okay, Nicole Hemmer and Jamelle Bouie, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jody.
Now, before we go, some of the more esoteric topics we didn't get to this week include the return of legal alcohol to America, the 19th century expansion of the Supreme Court, and the end of Rick Santorum's 2012 presidential bid. You can find moments like that and more on our Instagram and Twitter feeds at ThisDayPod. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. You can find lots more about our show at thisdaypod.com. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Next up, we've got Jamelle back for one more episode. We'll be talking about Martin Luther King's 1963 letter from Birmingham jail and the role of Christianity in liberal politics. That's coming up on Thursday. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Will you tell our panel, please, what your name is and where you're from?
My name's Samuel J. Seymour. I'm from Maryland.
How old are you, by the way, sir?
96.
96 years old.
You witnessed something to do with Abraham Lincoln. Was this a pleasant thing? Did Mr. Seymour witness the shooting of President Lincoln?
Radiotopia from